The Machiavellians, Part 5. Robert Michels, The Limits of Democracy. Robert Michels was a German-Italian sociologist and political scientist. His work on organizational power dynamics, particularly his conception of the iron law of oligarchy, left a lasting impact on political theory. Born in 1876 in Cologne, Michels grew up under a newly unified Germany. The unification of Germany in 1871 under Bismarck created the political backdrop for Michels' early intellectual development. Initially drawn to socialism and labor movements, Michels joined the Social Democratic Party of Germany in his youth. However, his critical observations of the hierarchies and operations of supposedly democratic organizations led to his most influential work, Political Parties, in 1911, which introduced his famous iron law of oligarchy. This theory proposed that all organizations, regardless of their initial democratic intentions, inevitably develop oligarchic tendencies as they grow and bureaucratize. Disillusioned with German politics and facing academic discrimination for his political views, Michels relocated to Italy in 1907, where he taught at the University of Turin. His move to Italy placed him in the aftermath of Italian unification, which occurred the same year as Germany's, allowing Michels to observe firsthand the challenges of nation building in two newly unified nation-states. Moreover, at the University of Turin, Michels interacted with other prominent members of what became known as the Italian elitist school of political theory, like Gaetano Mosca and Vilfredo Pareto. In Italy, Michels' political views evolved, or one might say devolved. Initially a critic of nationalism, he gradually embraced aspects of Italian nationalism and eventually supported Mussolini's fascist movement in the 1920s. This ideological shift reflected both his personal journey and the tumultuous politics of interwar Europe. This also raises an interesting tension between Part 4 and Part 5 of Burnham's book. Burnham did not regard extremists as true Machiavellians. As explained in Part 4, Burnham disqualified Sorel from the Machiavellian tradition because Sorel was a political extremist. Yet in Part 5, Burnham did not apply the same analysis to Michels. Michels was a fascist sympathizer who, unlike Mosca, did not disavow his fascism. Thus, it seems appropriate to point out this inconsistency in Burnham's analysis. If Sorel was not a true Machiavellian because of his political extremism, it seems Burnham should have also dismissed Michels from the Machiavellian tradition for the same reason. Michels died in Rome in 1936, leaving behind a complex legacy that reflected the tensions of his era. He was a German-born scholar who became Italian, a former socialist who embraced fascism, and a social democrat who ultimately concluded that true democracy was unattainable in large organizations. The following summary examines Michels' analysis of democracy as interpreted by James Burnham, exploring the inherent tension between democratic ideals and organizational realities. Among others, such realities include the inevitability of leadership, the historical tendency of top-down control, the limits of democracy, and the iron law of oligarchy. Chapter 1. Michels' Problem. Burnham framed Michels' investigation as beginning with a fundamental question, quote, "In what ways is the realization of democracy affected by the tendencies inherent in social organization?" End quote. This question struck at the heart of democratic theory, examining not abstract principles and ideals of democracy, but the practical mechanics of democratic implementation within organizational structures. To this inquiry, Michels offered a straightforward and challenging conclusion. Democracy cannot be realized because society inherently tends toward oligarchy, not democracy. Using Burnham's framework of formal versus real meaning, as described in parts 1 and 2, we can understand modern democracies as formally proclaiming democratic principles while functioning in reality as oligarchies. This gap between democratic rhetoric and oligarchic reality paralleled George Sorel's analysis of political myths. Democratic ideology represents a necessary myth that modern politicians can neither ignore nor disparage. As Burnham explained, politicians must, quote, "express themselves usually in terms of democratic ideology, since such an ideology is the accepted form of modern political thinking," end quote. A political candidate representing an ideology outside the accepted democratic orthodoxy has virtually no chance of being elected. To illustrate this point, Michels offered the following hypothetical scenario. Quote, "A conservative candidate who should present himself to his electors by declaring to them that he did not regard them as capable of playing an active part in the influencing of the destinies of the country, and should tell them that for this reason they ought to be deprived of the suffrage, would be a man of incomparable sincerity, but politically insane." This observation led Michels to a Machiavellian conclusion. Politicians must necessarily engage in deception. Specifically, they must present themselves as representatives of democratic ideals. or at minimum, they cannot tell the truth about democracy's limitations. The truth, according to Michels, is that democracy is impossible because the constant oligarchic tendencies inherent in social organization necessarily prevent its realization. Chapter 2, The Fact of Leadership. Central to Michels' analysis is what Burnham called the fact of leadership, or the observation that all political arrangements necessarily require a leadership class. This leadership class is, by definition, always a minority, even in so-called democracies. Interestingly, this represented one of the only points upon which one of the Machiavellians agreed with Jean-Jacques Rousseau, whom Michels even credited as, quote, the founder of this aspect of the criticism of democracy, end quote. Rousseau defined democratic government as, quote, the exercise of the general will, end quote. This general will, which Rousseau conceived as, quote, simply a collective being, can be represented only by itself, end quote. Therefore, Rousseau concluded that, quote, at the moment when a people sets up representatives, it is no longer free, end quote. In other words, when people relinquish political functions to representatives, they necessarily surrender political power to a minority of individuals. As Burnham explained, quote, there must be leaders because there must be a way of deciding questions which the membership of a group is not in a position to decide. Thus, the fact of leadership, obscured by the theory of representation, negates the principle of democracy, end quote. Moreover, Michels argued that the masses could not rule themselves even if they wanted to. As Burnham noted, quote, the mass, both as a body and in terms of most of the individuals composing it, is incompetent to carry on the work, end quote. But perhaps more fundamentally, all organizations require leadership. As Michels asserted, quote, no undertaking can succeed without leaders, end quote. These leaders direct and control the masses, not the other way around, as democratic theory suggests. And since leaders are indispensable to any important organization, they represent a permanent feature of society. As Burnham concluded, quote, their genuine indispensability is the strongest lever whereby the position of the leadership is consolidated, whereby the leaders control and are not controlled by the mass, whereby, therefore, democracy succumbs, end quote. Chapter 3, The Autocracy of Leadership. Having established the fact of leadership, Michels proceeded to analyze how leaders manage the mechanisms of power. He identified 3 critical points of control that allow leaders to dominate the masses. First, leaders organize and control finances. What's more, these funds most often come from the pockets of the masses themselves, creating a situation where the masses fund their own domination. Doesn't that sound familiar? Second, and related to financial control, leaders control the press. This is a crucial point, as Michels declared, quote, the press constitutes a potent instrument for the conquest, the preservation, and the consolidation of power on the part of the leaders, end quote. With control of the press, leaders not only control the flow of information, they exert enormous influence upon the public's preference for leadership itself. In democratic societies, this means that the leadership class, through the power of the press, controls who gets elected. As Michels observed, quote, the press is the most suitable means of diffusing the fame of the individual leaders among the masses, for popularizing their names, end quote. At the same time, Burnham added, control of the press allows leaders to thwart their political rivals by, quote, undermining opponents either by denunciation or by keeping their names out of sight, end quote. The third mechanism of control managed by the leadership class derives from their ability to punish and discipline. The state, and by default, the leadership class, typically maintains a monopoly on violence, but physical force is not always deployed. Burnham notes that, quote, other punishments, such as fines and loss of rights or membership, can be equally effective from the point of view of protecting the leadership. In the case of trade unions, the loss of membership can be extremely serious, because it often means for the worker the loss of the right to make a living at his trade, end quote. Wielding these instruments of power, that of the press, finance, and mechanisms of punishment, the leadership class effectively subdues the masses. Control of these 3 areas, for Michels, essentially amounts to an autocratic leadership structure. Essentially, Michels observed that the leadership class in any organization gradually consolidates more and more power through control of that organization's finances, press, and punishment mechanisms. This tendency does not disappear with the introduction of democratic ideals and institutions. For examples of this phenomenon, Burnham pointed to Napoleonic France. Quote, both Napoleons ruled as democratic representatives of the governed, the people. Their democratically legitimate right to act as delegates of the people's will was confirmed in a series of broad plebiscites. The first Napoleon was overwhelmingly elected as consul for life. and then, in 1804, as emperor, the second twice as president, and finally, in 1852, as emperor, end quote. A democratically elected dictatorship remains a dictatorship nevertheless. Burnham called this phenomenon Bonapartism, which he regarded as, quote, the logical culmination of democracy, end quote. He argued that it is, quote, a grave historical error to identify Bonapartism with other forms of despotism. Bonapartism is not mere military dictatorship. It is not the traditional hereditary or God-derived despotism of absolute monarchies. It is not the oligarchical rule of a closed hereditary caste. Mature Bonapartism is popular, a democratic despotism, founded on democratic doctrine, and, at least in its initiation, committed to democratic forms. If Bonapartism, in fact, rather than theory, denies democracy, it does so by bringing democracy to completion. End quote. Chapter 4, The Iron Law of Oligarchy. The culmination of Michels' analysis is his famous concept of the Iron Law of Oligarchy. According to this principle, derived from Michels' observations of societal organizations, democratic self-government is impossible. Leadership is an inescapable feature of society, and leaders are typically better positioned to consolidate and protect their power than the masses are to challenge it. Michels put it bluntly, quote, the majority of human beings in a condition of eternal tutelage are predestined by tragic necessity to submit to the domination of a small minority and must be content to constitute the pedestal of an oligarchy, end quote. Damn, that's a little rough. I am just a pedestal. The masses can never and will never rule themselves directly. As Michels put it, quote, consequently, the question is not whether ideal democracy is realizable, but rather to what point and in what degree democracy is desirable, possible, and realizable at a given moment, end quote. Oligarchy is a constant, immovable fact of society, but it can be restrained by democratic tendencies, as Michels mused. Quote, democracy is a treasure which no one will ever discover by deliberate search, but in continuing our search, in laboring indefatigably to discover the undiscoverable, we shall perform a work which will have fertile results in the democratic sense, end quote. This last statement may seem confusing, perhaps even contradictory. How can it be beneficial to search for something that doesn't exist? Michels maintained that democratic sentiments, though mostly delusional, nevertheless instill in the masses the idea of self-government, which encourages the masses to challenge oligarchic rulers. In this way, however indirectly, democratic ideals create a situation in which the masses are encouraged to check the power of the ruling class. This relates to Searle's idea of the function of myth. Democratic ideas among the masses function as an intellectual challenge to the autocratic ideas of the ruling class. And theoretically, these competing ideals balance each other out. Despite his sharp criticisms of democracy, Michels still found it superior to other forms of government. As he said, quote, the defects inherent in democracy are obvious. It is nonetheless true that as a form of social life, we must choose democracy as the least of evils, end quote. And this last quote bears striking similarity to an aphorism from Winston Churchill, who famously quipped, democracy is the worst form of government, except all those other forms that have been tried, end quote. In sum, Robert Michels' analysis of democracy, as interpreted by James Burnham, presents a fundamental challenge to democratic theory by revealing the inherent tension between democratic ideals and organizational realities. Through his examination of leadership dynamics, Michels concluded that oligarchic tendencies are not accidental deviations from democratic principles, but inherent features of social organization itself. The Iron Law of Oligarchy suggests that democratic self-government, as traditionally conceived, is functionally impossible due to organizational necessities. Leaders inevitably and necessarily emerge, consolidate power through control of finance, media, and disciplinary mechanisms, and tend toward autocratic rule even when operating within nominally democratic frameworks. Michels' analysis does not necessarily imply that democratic ideals should be abandoned entirely, but it does suggest a more realistic approach to democratic theory that acknowledges the inherent limitations of democratic practice. The question becomes not whether a perfect democracy is achievable, but to what extent democratic principles can be meaningfully incorporated into organizations that necessarily tend toward oligarchic structures. By recognizing the fact of leadership, we may better understand the persistent gap between democratic ideals and political realities, and perhaps develop more effective strategies for mitigating the worst excesses of both. This concludes my summary of Part 5 of the Machiavellians by James Burnham. Stay tuned for Part 6, discussing the ideas of Vilfredo Pareto. And if you'd like citations and page numbers for each of the quotes in this summary, please see my Substack at benyaturi.substack.com. Thank you.